Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros and Leap, helping students to succeed in all kinds of tests from eighth grade to grad school throughout Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with test school and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 60 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is unpacking and solving math anxiety. But first, let's meet our special guest, Dan Roeder.
Dan Roeder is a math educator and researcher focused on understanding and reducing students' math anxiety. He currently serves as math department coordinator at Winston Preparatory School's New York City campus. He earned his MS in mathematics education from the University of Rochester as a National Science Foundation Noyce scholar, where his thesis examined the roots of math anxiety and practical classroom interventions. Since completing his research, he has focused on applying it in the classroom and sharing with educators at conferences across the country. Before becoming an educator, Dan studied economics and statistics at Duke University and worked in corporate development at BlackRock. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Dan, I'm excited to have you on the show, as is Amy, but it's more special for me because your mom is a close colleague of mine and we talk about you all the time. So finally, we have you on the show to talk about a topic that is really important for lots of parents and educators. Before we get into that, though, we'd love to hear a bit about your history, what you did before you got into education, and why you got into education.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me on. And it's funny hearing Amy give my little bio there is still surprising to me
Hear
a
one's
little
life
bit,
story, right?
right? Especially when if you had told college or BlackRock me that I was going to be 6 years into a teaching career, a math coordinator and department head and researching of math anxiety, I would have been like, you got the wrong guy there. But I think that something about just seeing the way that kind of predefined corporate role spells out all the steps for you, and at the same time, it sometimes feels difficult to make a clear individual impact in a career path like that. I just wanted to find something that I could not only make a positive impact towards others with every ounce of effort I was putting into my career, but something that would be a little bit more naturally intellectually engaging for me. And I loved my majors at Duke, economics and statistics, applying mathematical thinking to solve problems. So when a scholarship popped up for me at the U of R to be a math educator, I'm like, oh, well, it's a little bit of a different spin than calculating GDP on a macroeconomics midterm, but at the same time, it is taking mathematical thinking and mathematical principles to solve real world problems. So I just kind of had to look in the mirror and ask myself how I'd feel if I passed the opportunity up. And I didn't like the sound of that, so I went for it. And now, again, I'm 6 years into a career teaching, leading a department, and enjoying taking the research I did in my master's program about math anxiety and learning more about it on the ground in action every day with my students.
That's fantastic. Now, why did you choose to do your thesis on the roots of math anxiety?
We could actually toss this back to my mom a little bit. I think growing up with a psychologist in the house, there was always something curious to me about how the mind works. And when it comes to mathematical thinking, so much of when you're in the flow of a math problem can be intuitive and natural. There's not necessarily a whole lot I could figure out when it comes to unpacking like intuition or epiphany like moments. But when I think about what could be the biggest possible gatekeeper to mathematical thinking, problem solving, and success, it's if that cognitive frame of problem solving can't even get online. So the fact that understanding the mind was inherent to studying math anxiety, but it's also such a hidden, pernicious angle of what it means to be a mathematician, to do a math problem. Because if it's there, you don't even get as much of an opportunity to dive into the math problem and all the ways it can feel so empowering and satisfying to have those moments where something clicks for you. So exploring the mind, as well as the fact that if we don't understand math anxiety better, so many people are just never going to engage with the true process of thinking mathematically. And that's just kind of like a sad reality. So why not throw my hat in the ring, see what I can figure out?
It's kind of interesting too when you think about when we talk about anxiety that you don't think about other subjects in school and automatically connect them to anxiety. And yet with math, hearing that phrase of like math anxiety is something we actually, it's a pretty common place sort of term or sort of association. I'm curious, Dan, can you sort of define for us like what is math anxiety?
Yeah, so it's a good starting point to notice how differentiated math anxiety can feel before defining it, because honestly, it really is just another form of anxiety. And there's test anxiety, there's more generalized mathematics or more generalized academic anxiety. But as much as math anxiety can feel super distinct, it really takes on the constructs of all other similar forms of anxiety. So the way I've come to understand it through my research and through engaging in exploration and healing process with my students is that math anxiety is when the brain habitually enters into an emotional processing system and viewpoint when it experiences, sees, engages with a math problem. What we want the brain to be doing is getting into modes of numerical processing, mathematical computation. But when it comes to math anxiety, that system never has a chance to get fully online because instead the right amygdala and all these other brain regions that are primarily concerned with processing negative emotions is how the brain responds to the mathematical content. We want it to be cognition, problem solving, but instead the brain just habitually and pretty much automatically is instead gearing up into negative emotion processing mode all on its own.
So it makes me think, where does that come from? Like, how, are you born with it? Is it in your, DNA? Like, that's what's kind of interesting too, is like, how does one get it?
Yeah, so really what it comes down to is if there's a significant negative early experience in the student's exposure to math or repeated negative experiences, the brain is really good at learning. So if that student is going through very tough moments while doing math, that's what the brain is learning, that math equals stress, math equals anxiety, math equals fear, even math equals pain. So instead of the brain learning the math principle, the brain is intuitively making the connection between math and those negative experiences. And if it happens significantly enough or repeatedly enough, the brain is forecasting, oh, I need to be ready for that really uncomfortable, anxious moment when I see math because that's what has happened to me before.
So math anxiety is very much a conditioned response.
Exactly.
And would you describe, I love the way you described it as the brain undergoes or elicits an emotional response to something that shouldn't necessarily be emotional. And I hear very often when people talk about test anxiety, because I think I've heard that term once or twice.
Just a couple times,
Um,
right, Mike?
yeah, some people try to frame it as a fight or flight mechanism, but I think there's more than just that going on with math anxiety, right?
Definitely. And I would also say that I don't want to insinuate that the term emotional here only means negative. I think ideally there can be so much emotionally felt motivation and positivity when it comes to being an engaged, resilient math problem solver. I think the issue from the anxiety perspective is that the brain is busy coping with this flood of negative
Yeah,
emotions.
it's a negative emotional response because some people have, their math philia, right? They love math. They see
Exactly.
math and they're it's like Amy with tests, right? She gets excited. She has a very positive emotion.
Right. And that's what I think also drew me to the subject because I had so many of those positive experiences with math. And I took a step back and I'm like, wait, other people have not only missed out on that, but instead have this conditioned experience where literally like the brain lights up in its pain areas, even for people who are
Right.
particularly severely math anxious. So it's that conditioned coping, dealing with negative responses because that's what the brain learned to associate with math.
Yeah. And I see that a lot with students where I kind of watch them. I know for myself, like I don't consider myself to be mathematically inclined. I tended to be good at it. And, I don't shy away from it. Let's put it that way. But what I find with students is, they come to a math question like really uncomfortable. And let's say when they solve it, like they get an answer and it's not an answer choice. And their first response is to be flooded with, I'm not good at math. I suck at math. Like the sort of script, that negative self-talk is like self-reinforcing. Where I always say to them, that's funny that you have that response because when I get something wrong, my natural reaction is say, oh, let me reread that question again, or let me check my work again, or let me punch that back into the calculator. So my responses to something not being right isn't that emotional negative response. It's more of a, oh, let me check the places where I know errors can occur and see if that is in fact why I got this question wrong. And I think it's interesting.
But that's ego strength, isn't it?
No, it's not ego strength because again, I don't pretend to say that I'm awesome at math, but I think it's learning. It's how you speak to sometimes like how you speak to yourself when you encounter challenge, difficulty, or some kids will shut down when something doesn't math, if you will, they shut down as
Right.
opposed to taking action to explore what might have resulted in this, wrong answer, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're a great teacher. All those ways you kind of reframed how you would respond, and doing that in the moment with a student can be huge, especially because one of the major impacts of math anxiety, aside from the brain being busy processing things emotionally, what it does is also decrease access to working memory. So that host of options that you just drew on, which in some respect is muscle memory and experience, but you can also draw on that because your working memory is intact, being ready and able to pull out that other angle of problem solving you may need. So that shutdown from the students can be seen potentially as like a motivational thing or them needing to learn those other ways of responding. But I think most perniciously for me, uh, the fact that they in that moment, at least as of now, until some of that math anxiety is intended to directly, that's an unrealistic learning experience for them in that moment because their brain's working memory system is not online enough for them to access all those different ranges of continued problem solving moves, is where we're back to how important math anxiety is as its own construct. So then with working memory back in play, some of those additional problem solving strategies can be taught.
So what I think you're saying is that math anxiety, and I think I'm going to say by extension, test anxiety and performance anxiety creates a negative emotional response that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you tell
100%.
yourself you can't do it and
Right.
you freak out, you actually can't do it.
Right.
Exactly.
That's where the negative self-talk, and that's the psychology, right? Is
Yeah.
like you got to be really careful if that's where your brain always goes, you're shooting yourself in the foot every time you take a step.
Yeah, and
Um,
then the trick is that there's also that moment before the negative self-talk. You can't just fix the negative self-talk. There has to be this kind of comprehensive approach to, as noted in the title of this episode, kind of unpacking that individual's experience. So there's a little bit of space to reroute the self-talk, because when we go back to that definition of the habitual brain response, that self-talk is happening automatically for someone with significant math anxiety, and just attack, oh, say this to yourself, that's not going to reach it at its core enough to actually kind of reroute towards those numerical computational systems doing the heavy lifting when exposed to math. But it's tricky because what I'm also not saying is that positive self-talk isn't important. That has to be a step. But the fact that like there has to be this kind of pre-emotional step is where I think it can get tricky, because so often in math class it's the thoughts, right? So positive self-talk, it's not a math computational thought, but it's very much in the cognitive domain. But with math anxiety, there's also that emotional, affective component that kind of needs to be unpacked, explored by the student, by the individual with math anxiety before the positive self-talk can be tweaked to exist.
So you're saying that telling a student to shake it off or suck it up isn't enough?
It's not effective.
Exactly. Or even telling them exactly what to say to themselves. Do that, but also like it's got to be a little bit deeper too.
Now, I do want to bring up something because you're talking about working memory. And one of the things we've explored actually in the podcast is, memory. And actually, the research is showing that memory, retention skills are one of the serious learning skills that have really been compromised with COVID.
Mm.
So one thing I struggle with students is like, do you have the memory? Like, have you retained the information?
When you say the memory, you're talking about did you learn the formulas? Do you know your times tables?
Correct.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's like, if I knew I didn't really know them well enough, that would give me anxiety. Like knowing that I don't know something is going to create a normal, healthy anxiety. So the tricky part sometimes is I think with students too, is making sure they have the memory, they have the knowledge, so that is going to not, interfere with being able to access that, working memory when I'm actually in a stressful, potentially situation.
In other words, preparing for the test.
Preparing for the test to alleviate anxiety, right? I mean, that's there's a lot in test prep, Dan, that we do where it's like the more you know, we're hopefully creating this really strong knowledge base that can, withstand that, like, or prevent that math anxiety from kind of becoming crippling.
Definitely. I think where math anxiety becomes so tricky is that if the student is math anxious in the classroom, less access to working memory to draw on super foundational stuff when they're learning that new formula. How are they really going to internalize that formula into a new learned moment, into a new memory? And then even if they do a little bit, are they really going to access it in the most challenging moment if they're still anxious when the working memory is struggling? So it's this, we talked about the kind of vicious cycle from the internal perspective of the student when that positive self-talk doesn't exist, but there's this extra vicious learning cycle, and that without the working memory in the moment, how do you codify it into new long-term mathematical knowledge? And if, let's say, you only get halfway, if you're still anxious, are you really pulling that out the next moment you need it without the working memory, and so on and so forth? And I mean, I can't cite research for exactly what I'm about to say, but when we look at math scores in the tubes, how students are feeling about themselves these days in general and post-COVID, I would love to see a study that was able to like quantify the impact of math anxiety on uh, where the state of American math education is right now. Because I have to imagine, based on the cycle I just described, some of the most at-need students for positive learning experiences, even if they're somewhat in the position of getting one, it can't take root until some of this math anxiety is alleviated.
I think what's also interesting too is when I think of math, there is something very straightforward, matter of fact. Like if you were to say regurgitate or do this question, when it's straight up, the kids often are, what they don't like are what they'll say, right? Word problems, story problems, where we're getting into the situation of the application of the information. I think that's where too many students struggle because they may know the information. It's, can you recognize it in a real world pragmatic situation, which is oftentimes what we're finding in test prep. Those questions live in that realm of word problem, story problem. So, it's the carryover, like the kind of the realization or the connection of what in a situation that may seem new to you, let's just say.
Yeah, and that's a great articulation of like an example of working memory, seeing that story problem, that word problem, finding the cue, and then letting that cue connect to your knowledge base in the moment you need it. That connection right there is the essence of working memory. And especially in a word problem where it's not presented in an obvious way, cueing to you, that's going to increase the load on what the working memory needs to do. And that's a very, very tough ask for someone with math anxiety.
Yeah, that's All true. So we've unpacked it a bit. Let's get to the solution part. How can, and I mean, I don't think this is something that we expect people, students, to manage themselves. So, from an external support perspective, how can someone help a student or their own child alleviate math anxiety?
Yeah, there's a lot of really powerful research about the range of interventions that exist for math anxiety in a very significant positive way. Some of them include bibliotherapy or really just explorative journaling about the math anxiety experience.
Is that what bibliotherapy is?
Yeah,
Journaling.
Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
pretty
I love
much.
Okay.
it.
Just but with that tweak of like therapeutically oriented to the particular thing you're trying to grow from. There's also mindfulness specific oriented interventions that have shown positive impacts, cognitive behavioral interventions, identity intervention, mindset interventions. And when I saw this, I'm like, where does a teacher start with all that? It's decision paralysis. It's like
Hmm.
shopping on Amazon, except now it's all these different options. What would you choose? So where my thinking came in after seeing all the different positive options, but feeling like I wouldn't know exactly where to start with what in my classroom was to really try to synthesize and understand what are the roots going on in all of those, such that there's a way to, even in just a little moment, put someone in the position to have a bit of growth or a bit of healing when it comes to their math anxiety. And as I understand it, really just a few steps that are pretty aligned with overall anxiety management, um, even outside of math anxiety. And the first is you have to notice when you are feeling that difficult emotion. If you can't notice it, recognize it, ideally contextualize it in some way, it's always just going to be this kind of boogeyman haunting you because you're not grounded or in touch with the experience enough until it is noticed specifically for what it is. From there, and this can be a hard step, is you actually have to accept that very difficult feeling. And I wasn't kidding when I said that there's research that shows that the pain regions of the brain can light up for people with severe math anxiety. So after noticing it, you actually have to be able to feel it. Otherwise, it starts that classic anxiety vicious cycle where you try to block it out so it comes back stronger and you try to block it out even more. So it's not that even as much of like, accepting it is this super panacea, but it's almost like you just need to avoid the vicious cycle that comes with when you try to avoid it or deny its existence. So you need to accept it really just to keep the ball rolling from there.
Well,
And
it sounds
then
like all this mindset talk when we say when kids fall into wanting to get that negative mindset by trying to nip it in the bud or stop it before they articulate it. This is what we're saying. It's because you say it. And if you keep saying it, you keep thinking it, and then you believe it. So it does
exactly.
make sense.
And then that leads to where there's an opportunity to totally reframe that negative self-talk, and that once you've noticed the emotion, once it's accepted, there's a little space there to notice, wait, it's just an emotion. It's just something I'm feeling right now. What if instead of it being this reason for you to shut down, what if it's an incredible opportunity to learn? What if it's an awesome opportunity to grow not only as a mathematician, but as a person? Because by finding a way to re-engage, you're not only keeping on with that math, but you're growing in your overall emotional
So there's no shame
resilience.
about it when you think of it that way, right? You can't
Exactly.
shame yourself, right?
Exactly. Or what if it's just a moment to take a break? There's a big difference. No one gets an F for taking a walk or getting a drink of water in math class. What if it's a cue that you actually just need a moment to make sure that that working memory, that number sense get back online? And I think that that's a powerful one because it can give space from a particularly intense emotional reaction, but like plant a seed for where shutting down is no longer the true response.
Yeah,
Uh,
and you can, even if you can't get up and walk out of a test, you could at least put your pencil down and just, again, give yourself that
Practice
moment.
some breathing or,
Very
take a
often
yeah.
we
deep
tell
breath.
students, like, if you're not working productively, stop working for a moment.
Mhm.
Recalibrate, rebalance, get back to your center.
Exactly. And I think with those steps, just noticing it for what it is, letting that emotion be present for a moment, which gives the space for some conscious reframing, actually getting in some positive self-talk, or at least neutral self-talk as a starting point, over time, that can become a habitual process. And there can be this overall reappraisal of what that agitated feeling is. And that's kind of my favorite viewpoint about math anxiety because there's some psychology research that goes back over 100 years. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and it shows that,
Mike is very
Love
familiar.
that.
Mike
right?
loves bringing up
So
that.
that's my favorite reframing idea
Yes.
because there's this accessibility to go from overly stressed. It's just a shift. You're already in the universe of peak performance. So just reducing that emotion. Again, this hasn't really been studied specifically in the context of math anxiety, but I love how that visual presents how effective problem solving peak performance is actually kind of one step away with enough of those rotations of notice, accept, reframe to just be right in the mix of doing whatever you want, whether math plays a role or not.
And just to clarify, so if people could envision a basic bell curve, and you have basically the leftmost quadrant is you're not stressed enough.
Right.
The middle to the peak of the curve is what's called eustress, EU stress, meaning
The
good. So
good kind.
positive stress, that means you are present and focused. And then as you head further and further to the right, you fall into distress. And right, and so what you're saying, Dan, is really valuable for people to hear. If you're stressed, you're kind of in the right place. You just need to back it up a little bit and turn your negative stress into positive stress because positive stress is the feeling that we have that what we're doing matters and that we can bring our best to the process. And by doing that, by recognizing that, we actually can tap into our highest resources.
Exactly. And what I love so much about that viewpoint is it is simultaneously psychologically true, but it's also a reframing, right? We
Yes.
just reframed what that stress can be. It can be the motivator, it can be the exciter to go problem solve, go push yourself, go work hard. So I love how it simultaneously can exist as just this truth of psychological research, but with that knowledge, passing that on to students, even just in little moments in math class, that can be what they need, what they call to mind in that moment of distress that acts as the reframing that starts to just create a new habitual process
Right,
when
because
they're exposed to math.
they can visualize themselves on the curve and say, well, I'm down here, but all I got to do is roll it back up the hill a little bit. And
Exactly.
picture yourself climbing that hill, getting to the peak, and staying there. If you feel yourself wobbling, reorient yourself.
Yep.
So, Dan, have you had the experience of seeing students implement these strategies on their own or with help and actually move from a place of math anxiety to, let's not say math mastery, but at least comfort and a working ability to access their capacity?
I have, and I want to add a little caveat to that because I think one of the reasons I've been able to do that is actually specific to the school I work at. We are a private school specifically serving students with learning differences, and one of the ways we really try to optimize for their learning is centering their overall skill development as students, as people, in addition to the content they learn. And when I say that, reframing of that is essentially that I am not nearly under the same amount of stress to hit an exact number of content standards to position kids for a state test as other teachers. And I am technically doing my job, teaching them resilience, teaching them self-regulation when I make space in my classroom to go over the sort of solution-oriented process we just spoke about. So the fact that I've done the research, and I get to lead a classroom where I am doing my job to the fullest extent when I make those moments, and I don't have to feel the burn and the stress of all those different Common Core standards you have to hit, or if you're in your New York, the next gen standards and the regents. And I feel very fortunate every day that I have a teaching practice in a classroom that allows me to optimize around this, let alone for students who are so in need of it, because I I don't know how much research there is on it. There's a little bit connecting learning differences to math anxiety, but it is at elevated rates, or even if it's just their overall student identity. Maybe it's not math specific, maybe it's full on academic anxiety. But the fact that I have the ability to kind of customize my instruction around that allows me to do it in a way that sometimes I feel wishful that other teachers had the same opportunity time-wise.
I understand how you feel. Well, listen, Dan, this is fantastic. I know we could talk about this topic with you all day. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Email is great. It's roeder.dan4@gmail.com, and I think that'll be in the show notes, right?
Yep. Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Tests and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Tests and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.